Imagine a man standing in the frozen wastelands of Eastern Europe, his breath fogging in the night air, his uniform bearing the insignia of the German Wehrmacht. Hours earlier, he had stood in the ranks of the Red Army, sworn to defend the Soviet Union at all costs. Before that, he had marched under the banner of the Finnish forces, and even earlier, had pledged his loyalty to the French Foreign Legion. One man, one soldier. Yet his boots had crushed the snow, the mud, and the blood-soaked earth for both the Allies and the Nazis. His name? That is where the mystery deepens, because to some, he was a traitor, to others, a survivor, and to a few, a ghostly legend of World War II. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the battlefield, artillery roaring in the distance, the sky torn apart by planes, the ground shaking beneath relentless fire. Somewhere in that chaos, one soldier kept switching sides, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force, sometimes by the strange hand of fate. Was he a spy, a mercenary, or simply a man cursed by the times? Tonight, we unravel the haunting tale of the most mysterious soldier of World War II. Who was the soldier who could never choose a side? What kind of man fights under 4 different flags in the bloodiest war humanity has ever known? What kind of fate drives one soldier to wear the uniform of the Allies one month and march beneath the swastika the next? Was it betrayal? Was it survival? Or was it something far more complex? An entanglement of chance, politics, and the cruel machinery of war. The story of this man begins not with a battlefield, but with a boy, born in 1916 in Estonia, a land caught between empires, forever shifting under the tides of history. His name was Lauri Torni, though later the world would know him as Larry Thorne. To understand him, you must first imagine his childhood. Picture the gray Baltic skies, the forests heavy with silence, and a nation sandwiched between the ambitions of giants. The Soviet Union to the east, Nazi Germany to the west. A boy grows up in this borderland with a sword already hanging over his head, because in the 20th century, Estonia was never a place of peace. It was a pawn on the world's deadliest chessboard. From the beginning, young Lauri was restless. He trained in skiing, survival, and endurance, learning to move like a shadow through snow and ice. These were not mere games. In Finland and Estonia, young men were prepared for war long before it arrived. He was lean, wiry, and possessed of a fierce determination. Yet behind his eyes burned something darker, a recognition that in his lifetime, neutrality would not save him. When Europe erupted into war in 1939, he did not wait to be drafted. He sought the battlefield. The first uniform he wore was Finnish. The Winter War had exploded when Stalin's Red Army invaded Finland, expecting an easy conquest. But Finland resisted with a ferocity that stunned the world. Imagine the Soviet columns, tanks churning through snow, thousands of soldiers advancing in gray waves. And then, out of the frozen woods, silence breaking into chaos. Finnish ski troops gliding across the drifts like ghosts, rifles cracking, grenades flying, small bands of men tearing apart massive Soviet forces. Lauri Torni was one of them. His endurance on skis, his uncanny ability to navigate forests, his hunger for risk made him stand out. He became part of a legendary resistance. Men who proved that courage and cunning could wound even a giant. But the war ended with Finland forced into a bitter peace. The Soviets took land, the Finns mourned, and Lauri, like many soldiers, was left unsatisfied. For him, war had only just begun. He could not accept defeat. He could not stop fighting. And so his path twisted into darker alliances. In 1941, when Germany turned its armies against the Soviet Union, Finland saw an opportunity for revenge. The continuation war began, and Finland aligned itself, at least temporarily, with Nazi Germany. For Lauri, it was not an ideological choice. He was no Nazi zealot. He was a soldier who wanted one thing: to drive the Soviets back, to reclaim what had been lost, to crush the enemy who had invaded his homeland. And so, with a cold heart and burning resolve, he entered into German training programs. He fought shoulder to shoulder with Wehrmacht and SS units, earning a reputation as a ruthless and daring leader. But here lies the paradox, the moment that makes his story so extraordinary. Fighting alongside the Germans, he became a decorated officer, even joining the Waffen-SS for specialized training. Yet to his core, he was not fighting for Hitler's cause. He was fighting for Finland, for survival, for vengeance. In his mind, His allegiance was to his people, not the ideology of Nazism. Still, history rarely makes room for such distinctions. The world would remember his SS insignia more than his intentions. Imagine him now, an Estonian-born Finn, wearing a German uniform, leading men through the forests, ambushing Soviet patrols, cutting supply lines, and vanishing like a phantom into the snow. His soldiers adored him. His enemies feared him. And his legend grew. He became known as a man who could not be broken, a soldier who thrived where others faltered. But fate is cruel to men who try to outpace it. By 1944, the tides of war had turned. Germany was crumbling. The Soviets surged westward once more, pouring over the Finnish frontiers. Finland sued for peace, abandoning its alliance with Germany. Suddenly, Lauri found himself stranded. An officer who had fought for both sides, a man without a country, without a safe home, marked by the uniforms he had worn. The Soviets wanted him dead. The Germans were collapsing. And Finland could no longer protect him. So what does a soldier do when every path is closed, when every allegiance becomes a liability, when every uniform paints a target on his back? Lauri Torni fled. But he did not flee in surrender. He carried his weapons, his scars, and his defiance with him. He would reinvent himself again and again, across borders and oceans. He was becoming not just a soldier, but a living ghost of the Second World War, a man who belonged nowhere, yet fought everywhere. And yet, the story is only beginning. Because as the war ended in Europe, Lauri's fate carried him into new lands, new armies, and new battles. He would wear the Allied uniform. He would fight under the stars and stripes. And still, he would remain haunted by the shadows of the choices he had made. The mystery deepens. Was he a hero, a mercenary, or a man cursed to forever serve the ambitions of others? The answer lies in what happened when he crossed the ocean, when the war refused to let him go, when the Cold War demanded new soldiers, and when Lauri Torni, reborn as Larry Thorne, answered the call once more. But before we follow him across the seas, we must linger in the ruins of Europe, in the ashes of World War II, where he was hunted as a fugitive, branded as a war criminal, and yet still revered by those who had fought by his side. What happened next would not only shock the soldiers who once followed him, it would astonish the very nation that would one day call him its own. How does a fugitive of war become a hero in another army? What happens when the war ends, but a soldier cannot stop fighting? What becomes of a man who has served under the banners of enemies and allies alike, when peace finally descends upon a shattered continent? For most men, the end of World War II brought a chance to rebuild, to return to families, to heal. But for Lauri Torni, the man who had fought for Finland, for Germany, and against the Soviets, peace was not salvation, it was a trap. And in that trap, he became both a fugitive and a legend. The year was 1945. The streets of Europe were in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, nations bleeding from wounds that would take generations to mend. But for Lauri, survival was no simple matter of finding food or shelter. He was marked. To the Soviets, he was a dangerous enemy, a commander who had humiliated them on the battlefield, a man they wanted dead at all costs. To the Allies, he was tainted by his service with the Waffen-SS, even if his loyalty to Hitler's ideology had been non-existent. To Finland, his homeland, the situation was equally dire. The new peace agreement with the Soviets demanded that men like Lauri be punished, imprisoned, silenced. Imagine him, hiding in the shadows of post-war Europe, moving from safe house to safe house, never sleeping deeply, always listening for the sound of boots on the stairs. The Finnish government, under Soviet pressure, arrested him. He was sentenced to prison for treason, not because he had betrayed Finland, but because his fight with the Germans had tied him to a regime the world now despised. Behind prison walls, he should have vanished, a forgotten relic of war. But Lauri was not the kind of man to fade away. He escaped. Again and again. Each time he was caught, each time locked behind bars, he found a way out. Like a fox refusing to be cornered, he slipped past guards, scaled walls, disappeared into forests, only to be dragged back and thrown into confinement once more. These escapes only fueled his legend. In Finland, whispered tales spread about the indomitable soldier who would not yield, who defied even the bars of his cell. To some, he was reckless. To others, he was a symbol of unbroken resistance. Finally, after serving time, after years of persecution, Laurie realized he could not stay. Europe was closing in on him, and the Soviets' reach was too long. There was only one path left: to vanish into the wider world, to reinvent himself. And so, in the late 1940s, he slipped away, making his way across borders, eventually boarding a ship bound for America. Now imagine the scene: a rugged, battle-hardened man stepping onto the docks of New York City, the towering skyline rising above him, the Statue of Liberty watching silently. He was no longer Laurie Torney, the hunted soldier of Finland. He would become Larry Thorne, an immigrant with nothing but his scars, his skills, and his unbreakable will to fight. America was a land of opportunity, but for Larry, opportunity meant only one thing: the chance to serve in uniform again. The United States in the 1950s was a nation bracing for a new kind of war. The Cold War had begun, and once more, the world was divided. The Soviet Union, Laurie's old enemy, had risen as a superpower. And the United States needed men who understood how to fight in brutal conditions, who knew the forests, the mountains, the tricks of guerrilla warfare. Larry Thorne was such a man. His past might have been murky, but his skills were undeniable. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. At first, he was just another immigrant recruit, his accent thick, his records incomplete. But soon, his talents set him apart. He excelled in every field: survival training, mountain warfare, unconventional tactics. He pushed himself harder than men half his age, driven by something no one could quite name. Was it vengeance against the Soviets? Was it the only life he knew? Or was it simply destiny, that he was born to be a soldier, no matter the flag? By the late 1950s, Larry had risen through the ranks. He became part of the newly formed U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets. These were America's elite, the warriors trained for missions behind enemy lines, for sabotage, for survival in the harshest terrains. Among them, Larry was a natural. His reputation grew once more. The men who served with him respected his discipline, his courage, and his uncanny ability to lead in the most desperate circumstances. And yet, imagine the irony. Here was a man who had once fought in a German uniform, now training American soldiers to fight against the Soviets, the very enemy he had despised since the Winter War. He had come full circle, his loyalties now aligned with a nation that embraced him, even as his past whispered dark secrets. But war has a way of finding those who cannot let it go. For Larry, his final battlefield would not be Europe, but the jungles of Southeast Asia. As the 1960s dawned, America's shadow war in Vietnam began to escalate. The Green Berets were deployed, and among them was Larry Thorne, the mysterious soldier who had fought under 4 flags, who carried the ghosts of 2 world wars into a new one. Picture him now, older but still sharp, moving through the dense jungle, teaching young American soldiers how to ambush, how to evade, how to survive. To them, he was a mentor, a warrior whose eyes carried the knowledge of 1,000 battles. To himself, perhaps he was finally at peace, finally where he belonged, on the front lines, against an enemy, with comrades by his side. But the story does not end with triumph. It ends with disappearance, with mystery, with the kind of ending that leaves more questions than answers. For in Vietnam, Larry Thorne's fate would vanish into the fog of war, just as he had so many times before. His last mission would seal his legend forever, blurring the line between history and myth. And so, we are left to wonder, how does a man go from prisoner to fugitive, from fugitive to immigrant, from immigrant to hero? Was Larry Thorne running from his past, or was he forever chasing the only life he knew, a life defined by war? What happened in the jungles of Vietnam would not only bring his journey to an end, it would cast him into the realm of mystery, where his name would echo alongside the great enigmas of military history. But before we uncover his final mission, we must descend with him into that jungle, into the chaos of the Vietnam War, where the world's most mysterious soldier met his fate. What happens when a ghost of Europe enters the jungles of Vietnam? What does it mean when a man haunted by 2 world wars finds himself walking into a third? What happens when a soldier who has already cheated death more times than he can count steps into the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, where every leaf might hide an ambush, every shadow might conceal a rifle? This is where the legend of Larry Thorne takes its final haunting turn, where the most mysterious soldier of World War II crosses into a new battlefield, a new enemy, and ultimately into a mystery that has never been fully solved. The 1960s were a time when America's attention shifted from the ruins of Europe to the green hell of Vietnam. The Cold War had ignited brushfires across the globe, but Vietnam was becoming something more, a crucible of ideology, guerrilla warfare, and political ambition. For the United States, it was no longer just about defending allies. It was about stopping the spread of communism. And for Larry Thorne, it was deeply personal. The Soviets had been his lifelong enemy. In Vietnam, he saw another chance to strike against their influence, to fight the same war on a new front. Picture him, the seasoned warrior, now wearing the green beret of America's elite special forces. He is older than many of the men he leads, but in the jungle his eyes are sharp, his instincts honed by decades of battle. The younger soldiers look at him with awe. Here was a man who had fought in the frozen forests of Finland, who had trained with the most feared units of the German army, who had survived prisons, escapes, and oceans. His presence was like having a living legend in their ranks. The jungles of Vietnam were unforgiving. Heat pressed down like a smothering blanket, humidity turned every breath heavy, and the enemy seemed to melt into the landscape. But this was the environment Larry excelled in. His skills in guerrilla tactics, survival, and small unit leadership became invaluable. He taught his men how to move silently through undergrowth, how to lay ambushes, how to think like hunters rather than prey. In the dense green, where visibility was measured in meters and death could come from a single tripwire, Larry was calm, methodical, relentless. His missions were often secret, deep reconnaissance patrols into enemy-held territory, the kind that official reports barely acknowledged. He worked alongside South Vietnamese units, training them, leading them, sometimes even going far beyond the lines where few Americans dared to tread. To Larry, these missions were familiar, echoes of the sabotage raids he had once led in the forests of Karelia against Soviet troops. Only now, the terrain was different, the enemy dressed in black pajamas instead of gray coats, but the principles remained the same. He was once again the phantom soldier, striking from the shadows and vanishing before the enemy could grasp him. But fate was waiting. In 1965, Larry was assigned to a mission that would become his last. The task was to search for a missing team in the Laotian mountains, deep in territory controlled by the Viet Cong and Pathet Lao. It was a high-risk mission, the kind he had faced countless times before. He boarded a helicopter, armed, ready, his men beside him. As the blades roared and the jungle below blurred into green waves, no one knew it would be the last time they saw him. Somewhere in the mountains, the helicopter went down. The details are still clouded by conflicting reports. Some say the crash was caused by enemy fire. Others whisper it was the unforgiving terrain, the weather, the mechanical failure that doomed them. What is certain is this: Larry Thorne disappeared into the jungles of Laos, and his body was never recovered during the war. 4 years, he was listed as missing in action, a ghost once more, vanishing into history as suddenly as he had appeared. Imagine the mystery that followed. For soldiers who had known him, it was almost fitting that a man who had lived like a phantom, crossing borders, slipping through prisons, switching uniforms, surviving impossible odds, should end not with a funeral, but with disappearance. Rumors spread. Some claimed he had survived, gone underground, continued to fight in secret. Others believed he had been captured, his identity hidden even from his captors. The truth lay buried in the jungle, silent beneath the canopy. It wasn't until decades later, in 1999, that his remains were finally identified and returned. After so many years, the man who had once fought for Finland, for Germany, for the United States, was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, a soldier of many wars, finally finding a home among America's honored dead. And yet, even in death, the questions linger. Who was Larry Thorne truly? Was he a hero, loyal to the cause of freedom, fighting wherever he could against communism? Was he a mercenary, a man addicted to war, unable to live without the battlefield? Or was he simply a survivor, swept up again and again by the tides of history, forced to change uniforms because he had no other choice? His life is a mirror of the 20th century itself, chaotic, violent, shifting between alliances, filled with contradictions. A man born in one small corner of Europe became a soldier whose story stretched from the Baltic to the jungles of Southeast Asia, from the frozen trenches of the Winter War to the shadowy missions of the Cold War. But here is the haunting truth. Men like Larry are not supposed to exist. Soldiers are meant to have clear allegiances, simple loyalties, a single uniform. Larry broke all of that. He belonged everywhere and nowhere. He was both ally and enemy, both condemned and honored, both fugitive and hero. His legend endures not because he fit neatly into history, but because he didn't. And so, as we stand at his grave, as we imagine the silence of Arlington broken only by the wind, we must ask, did Larry Thorne ever find peace? Or was he forever a soldier without a country, a man destined to fight until the jungle itself swallowed him whole? The answer lies not only in the wars he fought, but in the way he lived, always in motion, always in conflict, always between worlds. And though his body rests in American soil, his spirit still roams the forests and mountains where he once moved like a shadow, forever the most mysterious soldier of World War II. But what if I told you that his story didn't just end in Vietnam? That his legend continued to ripple through the Special Forces community, through whispers of his ghostly presence on missions, through the way young soldiers spoke his name as if he were still out there? Because sometimes, legends do not die when the man does. Sometimes, they grow even stronger in the silence that follows. Why does the legend of Larry Thorne refuse to die? Why is it that some soldiers fade into history, their names etched only on forgotten memorials, while others, like Larry Thorne, grow larger with every passing decade? Why does the story of a man who fought for both Allies and Nazis, who vanished into the jungles of Vietnam, still stir the imagination of soldiers and historians alike? The answer lies not only in his battlefield feats but in the enigma of his identity. Larry Thorne's legend endures because it is not just about one man, it is about the contradictions of war itself. After his disappearance in Laos in 1965, official reports listed him as missing in action. For his comrades, this status was almost unbearable. Some clung to hope that he had survived. They whispered stories that perhaps he had escaped capture, living in secrecy, as he had so many times before. Others were haunted by the idea that he might have been taken prisoner, his fate hidden away in the jungles, beyond the reach of rescue. In the Special Forces community, his name became a ghostly presence, invoked in hushed tones, a reminder of the risks every man faced in those secret, perilous missions. But while the jungle held his body, his legend was already growing. In the decades that followed, the U.S. Special Forces spoke of Larry Thorne not as a man who had fallen, but as a warrior who embodied the relentless will to fight, survive, and adapt. To them, his story was a lesson that war does not give you the luxury of purity. In combat, loyalty is not always about nations or politics. It is about the man next to you, the mission in front of you, the survival of the day. Imagine a young Green Beret in the 1970s, hearing for the first time the tale of the mysterious Finn who had once worn a Nazi uniform, who had escaped prisons, who had remade himself as an American hero. To such a soldier, Larry was proof that identity could be forged in battle, not in ideology. He became a symbol of resilience, a man who refused to let history dictate his fate. And yet, for historians, Larry's story posed troubling questions. How should the world remember a man who fought for both sides in the most destructive war in human history? Was his service with the Waffen-SS an indelible stain, or was it an act of desperate alliance against a common enemy? Should his heroism in the U.S. Special Forces outweigh the shadows of his past? These questions have no easy answers, and it is this very ambiguity that keeps his story alive. By the 1980s and 1990s, his name had become almost mythical. Researchers and military historians began digging into archives, tracing his movements across Europe, uncovering records of his escapes, his imprisonment, his daring service. What they found was not a simple tale of loyalty or betrayal, but a portrait of a man shaped by geography, politics, and survival. Larry Thorne was born in a time when small nations like Finland and Estonia were caught between giants. To live, to fight, to resist, men like him had to make impossible choices. Then, in 1999, the mystery shifted. The U.S. military announced that remains recovered in Laos had been positively identified as Larry Thorne's. At last, after 34 years of being missing, he was brought home. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery was both solemn and symbolic. Soldiers in green berets stood at attention as his coffin was lowered, honoring him as one of their own. To them, his past did not erase his service. It was his final chapter, his final belonging. But with that burial came new life for his legend. Articles were written. Documentaries aired. His story began to circulate beyond military circles, capturing the fascination of the public. People were drawn to the contradictions. A man who had been both Nazi and American, both fugitive and hero, both condemned and revered. His life was no longer just history. It was a parable of the human condition in war. What drives us to keep retelling his story? Perhaps it is because Larry represents the uncomfortable truth that war is not black and white. He forces us to confront the gray zones of loyalty, morality, and survival. He shows us that a soldier's life is not always guided by ideals, but by circumstances, by chance, by the desperate will to keep moving forward. And perhaps there is something else, something almost romantic, in his legend. The idea of a soldier who could never die in the ordinary way, who vanished into jungles, who escaped prisons, who wore uniforms like masks and identities like shifting shadows. He was a man always in motion, always elusive, always beyond the grasp of a single narrative. Even in death, his ghost lingers, because stories like his do not end with a grave. They live on in the telling, in the curiosity of those who ask, who was he really? Picture yourself now, standing at his grave in Arlington. The white marble headstone bears his name, Larry A. Thorne. Around you are rows upon rows of soldiers, each with their own story. But none like his. You wonder what he would think, lying here among Americans, after fighting for Finland, Germany, and against the Soviets. Would he feel at peace? Would he laugh at the irony? Or would he still be restless, longing for the sound of battle? The truth is, we will never know. And that is why his legend persists. Because mystery is the oxygen of history. Larry Thorne's story is not just about what he did, it is about what we cannot quite explain. It forces us to grapple with the chaos of war, with the contradictions of loyalty, with the cost of survival. But if his legend refuses to die, what lessons does it leave for us, decades later? What does the story of one soldier, who fought for both Allies and Nazis, tell us about the nature of war itself? The final part of our journey will confront these questions, drawing together the fragments of his life to reveal what his ghost still whispers to us today. What does the ghost of Larry Thorne teach us about war, loyalty, and survival? What if history's greatest mystery isn't found in battles, treaties, or generals, but in one man's restless journey across every side of a world at war? What if the story of a single soldier, fighting for Allies, fighting for Nazis, escaping prisons, vanishing into jungles, reveals something terrifying and profound about the true nature of war itself? This is where the legend of Larry Thorne ceases to be just biography and becomes something more, a mirror of the 20th century, and a question mark etched across the conscience of us all. Larry Thorne, reborn as Larry Thorne, was never an ordinary soldier. His life was a chain of impossible escapes, of reinventions, of relentless motion. To follow him is to walk through the shadows of history itself. In Finland, he was a hero, the ski trooper who defied the Soviet giant. In Germany, he was the pragmatic fighter, wearing a uniform that would forever stain his name. In America, he was a Green Beret, honored as a man who gave everything in Vietnam. And in the end, he was a ghost, missing for decades, his body swallowed by jungle and time, only to be returned at last to rest among heroes. But his legacy forces us to ask the question, what does loyalty mean when the world collapses around you? To call him a traitor is too simple. To call him a hero is too easy. He was both, and neither. He was a man caught in the crossfire of history, whose only constant was his need to fight. And perhaps that is the unsettling truth, that some men are made for war, and when peace arrives, they can never quite belong. Imagine standing in 1940s Helsinki, as Soviet planes roar overhead, bombs tearing through the streets. You are a young man. Do you wait for your government to decide your fate? Or do you take up arms with whoever offers you the chance to fight back? For Larry, the answer was survival. When Finland allied with Germany against the Soviets, he went. When that alliance crumbled, he ran. When America offered him a uniform, he embraced it. His choices were not made in the luxury of hindsight. They were made with a rifle in his hands, with death at his heels. That is why his story is both inspiring and uncomfortable. It reminds us that war rarely fits into neat categories of good and evil. Soldiers do not always fight for ideology. Sometimes they fight because the alternative is to die. Larry fought because it was the only life he knew. And in doing so, He became a man without a country, a man of many flags, a soldier who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Even after his death, his legend grew not because of his victories, but because of his contradictions. He forced historians to wrestle with questions they could not answer. Was he redeemed by his service to America, or forever tainted by his service to Germany? Was his courage greater than his flaws, or were they inseparable? Every attempt to define him slips through our fingers, like jungle mist at dawn. And yet, there is something undeniably magnetic in his tale. Soldiers still speak his name. Writers still trace his footsteps. Audiences still lean forward when his story is told. Why? Because in Larry Thorne, we see the embodiment of war's chaos. We see how history can twist a man into shapes he never intended. We see how loyalty can be fractured, how survival can blur morality, how one life can hold both shame and honor in equal measure. Now imagine walking through Arlington National Cemetery. The rows of white stones stretch endlessly, each one a name, a story, a sacrifice. Somewhere among them lies the stone of Larry A. Thorne. To a casual visitor, it is no different from the others. But if you know his story, you stop. You linger. You wonder. You feel the weight of all the uniforms he wore, all the battles he fought, all the borders he crossed. You ask yourself, did he finally find peace here? Or does his ghost still wander, restless as ever? This is the haunting power of his legacy. Larry Thorne's story refuses to stay buried. It emerges in every conversation about loyalty, survival, and identity. It forces us to remember that history is not made only of heroes and villains, but of men trapped in the gray, doing what they must to live another day. And in that gray, in that murky space between good and evil, we find the truth of war. So, what does the ghost of Larry Thorne teach us? It teaches us that war is not just about nations, but about individuals who carry its scars forever. It teaches us that survival can demand choices we cannot comprehend from the safety of peace. It teaches us that legends are born not from purity, but from contradiction. And perhaps, most of all, it teaches us that the human spirit, however flawed, will always seek to fight, to endure, to defy the darkness, even if it means wearing many uniforms, carrying many names, living many lives. As the sun sets over Arlington, as the shadows lengthen across the fields of the dead, one can almost imagine a lone figure in the distance. A soldier, silent, watchful, still marching. Whether he is hero or ghost, traitor or legend, one truth remains. The world will never forget the most mysterious soldier of World War II. Because in the end, mystery is immortality. And Larry Thorne, soldier of many flags, has achieved both.